Hello everyone, welcome to week 5 of Codivate Python class. Our topic for today is try and accept. So what is try and accept? It is something used in Python programming that helps us identify errors and also check if user input is valid. We will go over the syntax and some of its specific uses in today's video lesson. Alright, first things first, here's the syntax. We have the try keyword spelled directly like this, and then we have a colon. Whatever is inside the indentation of the colon, similar to what we have with if statements, is executed. The computer tries to execute this. It's inside a try block. Except if this causes an error, then we go to whatever is in the except block. So the computer will try to create a variable x and assign the result of the string 1 plus the integer 1. However, if that causes an error, then we go to the except and then we print not a valid expression. So, using what we know about Python so far and concatenation, what do you think will happen when we run this? You can pause the video and make a prediction. Alright, I'm assuming you had a go at it. So, let's take a look at what goes on in the try block. We try to assign the string 1 plus the integer 1. We know that we can't do this because they're different types, so that would cause an error. So as soon as this causes an error, we go to our except block and print not a valid expression. So once we were to run this code, our output is not a valid expression. So it's better to get some error that we wrote ourselves in the except statement than an error from the actual compiler that'll stop our program in the middle. Alright, let's take a look at another example. One case that we would use a try and accept is if a method gives us an error. We looked at list methods a couple weeks ago, one of these being the index method. So the index method would give us an error if the item we're trying to find is not in the list. For example, here we have a list 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're trying to find the index of 5. Clearly there's no 5 in this list, so if you were to run this code, there would be a value error. If we wanted to actually get useful information, like instead of a value error telling us 5 is not in the list, a print statement that tells us 5 is not in the list, we would have to use try and accept. This is how we would do it. We would try to run the code that would cause an error. Here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're trying to find the index of 5 in that list. That's the code that could cause an error, because you never know if this item is actually in this list. And then in our accept, we print 5 is not in this list. So, in this case, we know that this would cause an error. So as soon as the Python compiler tries to run this code and it causes an error, it goes to the accept statement and prints 5 is not in the list. And when we run the code, we can confirm that that is the output. So this is one of the most important uses of try and accept, and it's when we're dealing with user input. Sometimes if we are performing mathematical operations with some user input, we want to make sure that they actually entered a number, and we can cast it as an int or a float. So we try to cast this as a float and then perform the mathematical operation inside this try block. However, if that doesn't work, we have to tell them, please enter an actual number. Because we don't know, what if they entered something like a bunch of letters and symbols? We can't turn that into a float. That would cause an error. Let's take a look at a few examples of running this code. So the user gets this message, enter a number to square. That's how our input statement works. And then let's say we type the word form of the number 9, N-I-N-E. So this string, N-I-N-E, will be assigned to the num variable. Next step of the code, we try to print float of the num. So we're taking this string 9 and casting it as a float. Well, that's the error right there. We can't take letters and make them a float. Remember, float is just a decimal number. We can't make letters a decimal number. It doesn't make sense. So immediately there's an error and we go to this except statement. This can't be executed, so we don't get an error, but instead we go to the except statement and print, please enter an actual number. So as you can see, that's what is printed. Now, if we were to actually do it correctly, enter a number to square and we gave it a float, 9.0, then this try block would be executed and we don't even go to the except. Remember, only if there's an error in the try, we go to the except. Alright, let's get some practice with the concept. Let's say we have a variable var. It is one of the following types: string, integer, list, tuple, float, or Boolean. Now use try and except to find out if the variable is in either this group, which is string, list, or tuple, or this group, float, int, or bool. You can pause the video, and if you're not sure, you can keep listening for the hint. Alright, so the hint here is what is something that we can do with one of these groups that would cause an error if you were to do it with the other group. Because try and accept is looking for the errors. So remember, that's our approach for this. And once we get which group this is in, we have to print the result. Alright, I'm assuming you at least attempted this problem, and we will go over the solution now. Okay, so what's going on here? Let's say we have a variable var as defined in the problem. We try to take the length of the var, and we know that we can only take the length of something that's a string, list, or tuple because there's more than one item in it. It's called an iterable because we can iterate through it or go through each item. We haven't learned loops, but iterable basically just means we can go through each item in it. So we try to take the length of it, and if taking the length of it, we can take the length of these, right? So if we take the length of it and there's no error, we know that it falls in this group. So we print var is a string, list, or tuple. However, if we try to take the length of it and there's an error, we know, okay, it's not an iterable, so it has to be one of these. So we tell it that its var is an int, float, or Boolean, because we can't take the len method of this. And remember, this won't get printed if it's a float, int, or bool, because as soon as there's an error with trying to take the length, we get out of the try and go to the except. So that this basically highlights what I just went over. If a line in the try block causes an error, in this case the length one, the lines under it are not executed and we go directly to the except. It's always a good idea to test our code just in case maybe we have some mistakes, and we want to test for like all the different cases. For example, in this last one, we want to check for string, list, tuple, and float, int, bool. So if we were to test all of these data types and run the program, we see when we have a string, it tells us it's in this category, which has string. If it's a list, it tells us it's a list. It tells us if it's a tuple, it tells us tuple. And same thing with all of them. For each different data type that we test, it has the correct print statement. So it's very important to test your code. And these tests show that our program on the previous slide works correctly. So now that we're using try and except to classify between two types or two groups of data types, that brings up the question, what if we want to know the exact type of a variable or value in Python? Well, there is a way to do this. We can use the conveniently named type function that will give us the data type of an item. For example, if we printed type and then in parentheses we put in the input, which is the integer 4, and we were to print this entire result, what would happen is that we get this result. We get these less than and greater than signs, then we have class, and then we have int. You don't have to worry about these for now. But the main thing to remember is that it gave us the correct data type. 4 is an int. It's an integer. It's a whole number. And this type will work for any data type that we looked at before. It will work for strings. As you can see here, we're getting the type of the string hello. It works here. It will also work for lists, tuples, booleans, floats. So it's pretty useful if we want to know the exact type of an item. And it's an inbuilt function in Python. Let's take a look at Boolean expressions with type. If we wanted to check if the type of a variable is actually a certain type. For example, we have a var here, and it's a list of all these numbers. And we have this another variable here called isItAList. Usually, variables that start with is are Boolean variables. And we are assigning it the value of this Boolean expression. Remember, the equal sign tells us that it's a Boolean expression. So this entire thing will be either true or false. Now let's actually figure out what it is. What is the type of this var? Well, we see the square brackets. We see a bunch of items separated by commas. So it's a list. And we compare it with list. So we know that a list, which is the type of this var, is equal to a list. And one thing you'll notice here is that we don't need quotations around this type. And that's because a type is just a keyword in Python. Python will understand this is that we're checking if it is a list. If we were to print this Boolean, since we know that it is true that the type of this is a list, our output will be true. And if this happened to be a tuple, then the output would be false. If it wasn't a list, the output would be false. All right? So, based on what we learned, we can redo the practice exercise using the type function instead of trying except. We can just check the type of var and see if it is a string, that's what we're doing in this first Boolean expression, or if the type of the var is a list, that's what we're doing in the second expression, or if the type of the var is a tuple. And in that case, we would print var is a string, list, or tuple. So there's pros and cons of both options. This one is 4 lines compared to 5 lines of the previous one, but this one also has a very long condition here. But this one also models the problem well. You can clearly tell what's going on here. We are checking if it's a string, list, or tuple. So this just goes to show that there are many ways to solve a coding problem, and you can decide which solution works better for you based on your understanding. All right, so let's take a look at the exercises for the day. For the first one, we have to ask the user for 2 inputs. We have to ask them to enter a string, and we have to ask them to enter an integer. We have to print the string they entered a certain number of times. And the certain number of times is just the integer that they entered. Alright, so let's take a look at a few examples of this code. This is how our console should look like when we run our code. Enter a string, let's say we type in yo, then we enter an integer, let's say 5. Then it should say yo, 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 basically doing this 5 times. But let's say we want to make sure that even if they enter an invalid integer, we make sure that there's no error. And the key thing is to use try and except. So if we try to print a string times a string, that won't work. And then we know that since a string can always be valid, but an integer may not be valid, we can let the user know that they entered an invalid integer. That's the first exercise. So you can pause the video and try to attempt this exercise, and we will go over the solution. Alright, so these are the second exercises. We will get to the solution of the first one after we go over the second ones. You can pause the video and then just try to run these code segments, but instead of directly typing them into REPL.8, you can try to go through these in your head or on a piece of paper and see what you think it will print, and then you can confirm your answers by going into REPL.it and typing these code segments. You can pause the video and attempt these. And once again, this is just exercise 2 continued. Also do the same thing with these code segments. See what you think they will print. All right, now let's go over the solution for exercise 1. This is the one where you have to print the string integer times, and string and the integer were both user inputs. So here, we're just making variables to store the user input in the first 2 lines. And in the second one, we try to print the int of the num. Remember, we have to use typecasting because user input is always seen as a string. So since we're multiplying here and we want to repeatedly print this string that they entered, we have to use the integer version of this num. So we try to do that, but we know that this may result in an error. What if they entered a num that's actually not an integer? In that case, we go to our accept block and print invalid integer. So that would take care of that. Once again, good idea to test our code. So we ran our code segment, and you see that the output lines up exactly with what we had on the exercise page. All right, let's go over the solution for this one. So in our exercise 2a, we have to go through a few code segments and see what it's going to print. So let's go to the solution of this one. We try to print the length of a Boolean true. Well, we know from our practice exercise that we can't take the length of a Boolean. We can only take the length of a string, list, or a tuple. So we know this would cause an error and we'd have to go to our accept. But what's this? We have another try and accept within our accept. So we've made it to this accept, so we have to execute this code now. We try to print the length of the string version of true. And once we cast a Boolean as a string, it will now be the string in quotations, capital T, R, U, E. We know that we can take the length of a string. So now, what's the length of the string true? Well, we have 4 letters, so that is 4. And once we were to try to print this, our output will be 4. And since this worked out correctly, we don't even go to the accept, we are done. Exercise 2b. We try to print the item at the 0th index of this list. I know we may be used to seeing lists as variables, but we can also use this just for demonstration. This will actually work. We have this list and we're getting the 0th index. So this works. We can just get the 0th index item in this list. Remember, Python starts counting at 0, so this would be the 0th index. This would be the first index, so our output is 1. Since the try block worked out without any error, we're done with the code segment and we ignore the accept. Alright, exercise 2c now. In our try block, we try to print the integer 1 plus the integer 1 plus the string 2. Well, we know that's going to cause a type error because we can't concatenate an integer with a string. So immediately we go to the accept block. We don't even try to take the user input because we know that this line will cause an error. We're done. We skip over it. We go to the accept and then we print 2 times the string 1. Remember, if we multiply a string by an int, it will just print this string however many times it's multiplied by. So we'll print the string 1 2 times. That's what this expression is saying. And our output will be 1 1, which is just the string 1 2 times. Alright, final exercise solution of the day. We have to use the same approach that we were looking at before. We try to get the length of a string called str. Since we can take the length of a string in Python, we continue to the next line of the try block. Since that line is just printing a string, there's no error, and the 2 lines here are executed. Since we're not actually printing the length of the string, just taking the length of the string, The only thing that's printed is works. And since this code worked here, we don't even go to the except block, so this is just ignored. One thing I want to review here is that here we didn't assign the length of the string to a variable. And you may be thinking, that doesn't do anything in Python. That's correct. If we were to type just on an empty REPL page length of string, nothing would be done. But the key thing is that it's a function call that doesn't cause an error. It doesn't cause an error because we can take the length of a string. So it works out, and we can use it in a try and except just to see if it will cause an error or not. So one more thing to take away from this is that we can use try and except to test function calls. We don't necessarily need to print everything or assign it to a variable, but we can just use a function call like this because we know that the len is just a function that we can call on a string or a list or a tuple. All right, that is it for this week. If you have any questions, you can contact us at this email or the Discord. And stay tuned for week 6.